we need now to pray for ourselves. And she has received a new job, and that is that she can pray in our behalf. Many people don't think that's true, but if you'll turn to the book of 2 Corinthians, the 5th chapter, you'll see Paul says, whether absent or present, we might always be pleasing unto God. There are people today in our society in increased numbers who would tell you they're good Christians, but not a part of any man's church. They tell you they're good Christians, but not a part of an assembly that they go to. They claim to respect Christ as the Messiah and Lord, but they don't want anything to do with the church. This independence is strange, especially when you read the Bible. And the question is often asked, is there any justification to feeling this way? What they define as church is something outside the realm of the Scriptures. And yet they blame the Scriptures and the God of heaven for not making the church what he had nothing to do with to begin with. Is there no relevance or importance to being a part of something Christ loves so much that he gave his life for? Can we be satisfied, if we love the Lord, with the feeling of complacency? We know the church is. We see the place where she assembles in a lot of instances. Can we be satisfied with the fact that we don't have anything to do with her? Have people not made themselves their own Bible and made themselves God? Isn't it God that needs to be satisfied? Or is it you and I? Have those who have practiced what they call Christianity, and they have a form of godliness but deny the power thereof, have done such a miserable job of living the Christian life that those in the world who have seen the way we live don't want anything to do with us? When I take my children to a denominational service and there is no remembrance of Christ in that place, well, what am I showing them? Who's the hero there? What am I trying to teach them as the main thing of importance for them to follow? What example am I trying to teach them as they are taken into this place? What drink am I teaching them to enjoy? What food have they been brought up on in my home? It is too often true that churches of Christ are not living up to what Christ demands. When we speak of these congregations, we're not speaking of denominations. We're speaking of the body of Christ. Some congregations are short and remiss on teaching the Bible at all. Others have tried to do what they did in the days of Samuel. We want to be like our neighbors round about us. They want to be like their neighbors and incorporate into their worship or into their life as an assembly everything that is like the world round about them. Too many congregations teach the truth of the Bible to an extent that the worshipers will allow, because they just won't allow too much more. Do these difficulties, however, mean that we can, if we are children of God, resist being a part of the church that Christ purchased with his blood? Can we call good evil and evil good? I get into a lot of conversations with people outside the realm of religious association, And they keep talking to me about hypocrites in the church. I tell you, there are hypocrites. But the place where there are most hypocrites are in the world. These are people that play one thing and do another. We must first understand that there can be no such thing as Christless Christians. In Ephesians 4 and 5, Paul says there's one Lord, one faith, and one baptism, one God and Father of all, who's above all, through all, and in you all. We read that there's one body, as assuredly as there is one faith and one Lord. In Ephesians, the 5th chapter, and the 29th and the 30th verses, the Apostle Paul again writes, no man ever hated his own body, but loveth and cherisheth it, as Christ loved the church. In Colossians, the 1st chapter, and the 18th verse, he's the head of all things pertaining to the church, which is his body, the fullness of him that filleth all in all. There's got to be something to this thing called the church. Or you might call it an assembly, more correctly so. But it is still that which God has placed in this world. They may not like it, but you got to learn some way to deal with it. You may figure out there's hypocrites in the church. Well, don't look in the mirror too much. Because, as is quoted in James, the 1st chapter, he that looketh into the perfect law of liberty, he being not a forgetful hearer, but a faithful doer of this word, this man shall be blessed in his deeds. We forget to quote 2 Corinthians 3 and about verse 14. We've got to look into the law of God. How can I be so perfect and anybody else be imperfect, and me associate with the imperfect ones? Paul identifies the body as the church. This is the body from which Christ gave his life. Anyone who is not a part of the group of worshipers intent on following the pattern given in the New Testament is not the church. It's not a part of the church. It's not even like the church. If you want to call it anything, it is the divorced church. It's not true that people who do not live together are described as married. And the people who don't claim to follow and worship God and fellowship with his church cannot claim to be married to Christ. And if we think that we can live without being in a marriage relationship to the God of heaven, we've commiserated a pitiful joke that we'll answer for eternity. Is it possible for a Christian to be a part of the church without being identified with a local group of believers intent on following the New Testament pattern? The Scriptures give no reason to believe that such is possible. Even while starting congregations as he traveled, the Apostle Paul established a local group based on the understanding that they must worship Christ regularly as commanded. There was no local congregation to which these people would attend that the Lord's Supper was not observed on the first day of the week. There's no local restaurant or bar or civic institution that has the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week. Why do a lot of people go to them? Upon the first day of the week, the disciples came together to break bread. The specific reason as to why they came together is stated. This breaking of bread is a part of speech which stands for the whole concept of the bread and the fruit of the vine. If the Lord's church assembles on the first day of the week, there's one thing that has to be here. The picture of our Savior. No wonder they were starting churches of Christ everywhere that the Apostle Paul preached. Because the very next day, on the first day of the week, or the very next week, or whenever the day occurred that the first day of the week came, they had to figure out where to get some unleavened bread and some high-quality grape juice. There was a commandment that they had to be obedient to. Are those groups that gather together and do not participate in that which is called the Lord's Supper called the church? No wonder they're starting to change the names of the places they assemble. What's the difference in the assembly of the old drinking hole and the assembly of the local Baptist church? This is not the first Sunday of the month, is it? Well, if it is, you can go get your drink at the Baptist church. But if it's the second Sunday or the third Sunday or whatever Sunday they decide to have it, it won't be there. You mean to tell me that it's just as well for you to show by example or by leadership your sons and daughters that it's not important for the Lord's Supper to be observed every first day of the week, and therefore you decide not to attend? They all gather together in these bars and places of ill repute to tell about their tall tales, their woes, and how they have exalted themselves as they take a drink. And the pastor gets up and tells about how great he's been able to overcome the devil, when he's probably the chief disciple in town that calls Jesus Christ a liar. You mean to tell me that these places are as good as the Lord's church in its worst existence? It is definitely hard to remember what has never been. And if we as children of God assemble to remember what Christ has done for us, if He's never done anything for these denominations, how can they remember what He did? When they eat of the bread, what do they remember? His body wasn't broken for them. They've shunned it. When they drink of the fruit of the vine, they're not remembering the blood that was shed that purchased the church, because the church that they're a part of was never purchased by the blood of Christ. It's hard to remember that sharing in fellowship with their Lord, these things that are near and dear to our hearts, is something that we can turn our back on any first day of the week. You mean to tell me then that a person can be a good Christian and negate the observance of the Lord's table? You mean to tell me that, well, me and the old man got it all worked out? Yeah, he lied about the plan of salvation. I don't have to be baptized. But he also lied about the picture of his hero that is portrayed every first day of the week on the table of the Lord. You see a lot of people who have pictures of their heroes in their homes. Some of them make it on their cars. I see some that have got bad things like that on their cars of pictures, or in other places. But when you go to a denominational church and there's no picture at all, what do you tell your child about what are you doing there? But when you walk into the assembly of the saints of God and the child sees on the table that is spread unleavened bread, although they may not understand that, you can explain it to them, and fruit of the vine, it's not something they probably pick up at the local 7-Eleven. And it's definitely not something that they find too much often mentioned or petitioned or practiced in a denominational assembly. They're going to ask you a question. When my kids were little, I think it was Leanna when she was about the age of Kylia. Her mother was back there in the kitchen fixing the Lord's Supper. And she walks up to her mother and she says, Mama, if that's the Lord's Supper, where's the Lord's breakfast? There's a lot of people that don't understand that questions are proffered because of things that are seen. And Christians are those who think more highly of others by trying to give them examples, not because we're smart enough to have figured out that this is the example we're supposed to do, but because we're smart enough to know that we have to obey Jesus Christ in order to be pleasing to His commands. Then you mean to tell me that you can negate a command of the God of heaven? You can say, I don't need to go to the church services. I don't need to take my kids. I don't need for me to worry about what they might learn and understand and know. They're definitely not going to be taught it in school. They're definitely not going to be taught it in communications and conversation on a job site. If you're on a job site and you hear people ranting and raving and using four-letter words and taking God's name in vain, and everybody standing around saying, there's nothing wrong with that. Everybody does that. I was on a job site the other day and an old boy hollered out like that. I said, no, those things have never done what you've commanded them to do. Only human beings are stupid enough to violate the law of God, to have such a vulgar thought as you've just expressed. And we don't talk like that on this job site. Well, it just happened to be that I was in a position that I could intend that not be true. And he knew that if he came out with that again, I'd throw him off the job site. But what about us taking our children to a place where the Lord's Supper is not observed? And then telling them that these people are Christians. God intends for Christians to be concerned about their children. That they need to understand and know. Poor fellow that used to worship with us had a daughter that he'd taken out of the church when she was about 14 years of age. She was killed on a motorcycle accident one night. And she was trying to remember what the unleavened bread was. Now, folks, if we have the insensitivity of worshiping where the Lord's Supper is not observed, we have the disobedient heart to allow ourselves to do what we want instead of what God has commanded. We let on like that going to a bar where the Lord's Supper definitely will not be, or going to a denomination which 90% of the time it won't be, or going around people have heroes sitting around of beer and canisters that glorify drunkenness and alcoholism. If we're going to do this, are we being what God has commanded us to be? You know, Paul says, not to forsaking the assembling of yourselves together as the manner of some is, but so much the more as you see the day approaching. For if we sin willfully, there remaineth no more sacrifice for sin. We're to assemble ourselves together. For what reason? Paul writes in the verse before this, consider one another. As we come here on the first day of the week, I have often wondered in my mind and never known the answer. On the day of Pentecost, when the Church of Christ came into existence, who supplied the unleavened bread and the fruit of the vine? Did somebody have a aspiration to go to Google and say, what are we supposed to do here on the first day of the week? Did somebody get a tip from heaven that this was to be done? Or is this that was supplied by the God of heaven to those who didn't even know they would have need? And yet we're smart enough to tell God thank you, but no thank you. We just don't need it at all. You see, my friend, the Lord's Supper is that is supplied by God for we who are not overly acute in our needs and our abilities not to succeed, to know that we have to have need of that. We need to understand and know that upon the first day of the week, the Lord's church, Christians, the assembly of the saints, whatever name the Bible has called it, we'll allow it to be. But it always will be, when you come together, is it not to partake of the Lord's Supper? Paul said, I received of the Lord that which also I delivered unto you, that the night in which Jesus was betrayed, he took bread and said, take, eat. This is my body, which is broken for you. And in like manner also he took the cup and said, drink ye all of it. For this is the New Testament of my blood, which is shed for you. We're not here just to waste time. We're not here just to enjoy each other's association, although we do that. We're here because we have a common love and a common need that is filled by an uncommon Lord. And as we are married to Christ and we're associated with the church that bears his name and wears his glory to the world by the life that we live, we need to make sure that on the first day of the week we are not mockingly dragging in at the last minute just so we can get there in time. We used to have a rule at the house. Supper was at 6 o'clock. You know who was there at 5:45? The hungry. You know who was there at 6:15? Somebody that probably stopped and cheated before they got home and wasn't as hungry as they should have been. God desires that we as children of God work together, both to strengthen each other and to further his purposes. Encouragement and accountability are important aspects of any marriage. If there is none of this, maybe there's the problem in the marriage. Even at the old drinking hole called a bar, a civic institution, or Miss Daisy's Rose Society, people get together whenever they feel like it. Not at the Lord's church. We get together to provoke others to feel good about themselves? No. We get together because he who knows what we need the most has intended that we can be successful in living the Christian life. So he has put this before us so that we can eat of his bread. We're not going to be talking about how we feel good and how we're thankful that we've been able to overcome, because we've not overcome yet. We're going to talk about the common salvation of our souls. We're going to meet to bear one another's burdens. We're not coming for a potluck meal. If Christians come together and do not as God has commanded, well, why have they assembled? I keep talking to these people in religious bodies that don't even consider having the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week. And I keep asking myself, well, what calls you together? If we have an assembly of people that were raised at the bar instead of the assembly of Christ, how can we expect the world to become a better place? What does a bottle of beer and potato chips remind the participant when they see it ingested? How does making eyes at somebody else's husband or wife, or exchanging vulgar language, suggestive talk, or being that which is detrimental to anything that's moral and decent, help raise a child in the way it should go? The older instincts are given away in our society to the new ones. And the new ones have an odor and a stench that mock decency and integrity. To any fair-minded person who questions the little thing that we do on the first day of the week as something unusual and distinct, you know that they've not been raised where it is common and understood. What they learned when they went to Sunday school doesn't even allow them to know what these words mean. Explain to little Jane what was right for her daddy to go home with his neighbor's wife or daughter and leave her destitute. And you could explain to little Jane where her father and her family spent most of their time. Unfortunately, local congregations of the Lord's church do not represent God's intention very well. Too many churches are encouraging more and more people to become passive in behavior and do not challenge their members to represent the community of Christ that is called the local church. Just because many churches fail to live up to God's desires, however, does not mean that we're off the hook, that we can quit too. God established the local congregation or assemblies in His wisdom for our benefit. And if God desired that you and I be mavericks, then that's the way God wants the job done. He recognizes that we're too weak to defeat Satan by ourselves, and that we need opportunities to assemble with each other, to show love to one another, to build up one another, to encourage, to exhort, and to help each other be children of God. This is the true wisdom of God that Paul wrote about as John penned it in the Revelation, the 19th chapter. This is the true wisdom. No wonder man-made denominations do not have the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week. They don't have anything to remember. They don't have any cause to glorify in. Their denomination was not begun by the death of Christ on Calvary's tree. Or they can have pictures of somebody hanging on a cross, which looks like a crooked snake. Or they can have somebody that shows some woman holding some baby in her arms. But they don't have a picture of the Lord's church assembled on the first day of every week, communing around the table of the Lord to help that assembly be strong in the Lord and in the power of His might. If you deprive yourself and your children the constant assembly around the Lord's table, if you let them act as the assembly is of no significance or unimportant, if all they do is run 15 or 20 times to the bathroom, or if they're standing there watching or playing with the radio or phone, or if they're involved in anything else, you're doing them more harm than good. The group of saints who believed and practiced according to the New Testament pattern took it extremely seriously, that which the God of heaven provided, that they could be successful in living the Christian life. Have you harmed your children by not attending and not acting and not addressing the assembly in the way it should be? Do you feel like you could just come when you come, if you don't want to come, or get here if you want to, and never on time? Or to figure that you can always be involved in something else that's far more important and make sure that gets done? Homework, schoolwork, which is coming up. But when it comes to coming to the study of the Word of God, or to being here when the Lord's Supper is observed, or to understanding what these emblems represent, is it just as well for your children to be taken to the local bar, where they'll also be taught how to live in this world? Is it impossible to be a child of God? It is. If everything that Jesus Christ has given us to make it possible is treated with indifference, lack of respect, and disdain. By the way, That's the definition of the word blasphemed. And as you blaspheme the law of God, as you treat it with indifference, don't mean anything to me. I get there if I want to. Lack of respect, I'm not really concerned about what my kids are watching and seeing. They'll grow up and they'll be all right. How many times has it been that we have been effective instruments of something or someone that we don't really want to be an assistance to, but because of what we do, it speaks aloud that our children can't hear what we say? No, there's no reason to call these people Christians. Christians assemble on the first day of the week. Christians assemble to meet around the Lord's table. Christians eat of the bread and drink of the cup every first day of the week. And I just can imagine that when the saints of God came together in these towns where they didn't have houses to worship in, but they had to meet out under the tree, or they didn't have a place where they could go, they didn't say, let's go over to the old bar. We can meet over there. You see, they even knew that there was a respective venue that the assembly that was there recognized to be. No, they didn't go over and rub elbows with somebody who's drinking a Miller Lite or a Schlitz Heavy or whatever else they're drinking. They didn't get in there, and when they walked in, they couldn't see because of the haze that was in their eyes as it was burning the smoke. My friend, we have been given an opportunity and a privilege. And somebody will say, well, I don't believe I'll have to go to anybody's church. Well, that just means you don't believe what Jesus Christ said upon the first day of the week, that of each of you gather together. Or as the example is given in Acts 20 and 7, 1 Corinthians, the 10th and the 11th chapters, upon the first day of the week, the disciples gathered together to break bread. If you're here this morning and need to respond to the invitation of the gospel, it's Jesus Christ who gave us this great blessing. He is the one who proffered this plan. He met with his disciples before the church came into existence. And he said, boys, I'm going to buy this church with my blood. It's going to cost me everything I've got. It's everything that I have. It's the pearl of great price. But I'm going to make it to where you can be successful in living the Christian life if you'll do what I've commanded you. And then these places that don't even have the Lord's Supper, don't even consider it. I see every once in a while, and I'll shut up. I go down the road and I was like, we're going to have communion this Sunday. Well, what happened to last Sunday? We didn't commune last Sunday? What'd you do when you went there? You're not having a communion next Sunday? Well, what are you doing then? What picture you got on the wall for next Sunday? You see, this picture is seen and shown and has been in the assembly of the saints of God for now almost 2,000 years. And they that remain faithful will I give the crown of life. If you're here and need to respond to the invitation, will you come as we stand and sing?